Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour à tous et à tous. We are joined by a number of speakers today. Following opening remarks, we will start with any questions that we may have in the room, followed by questions over Zoom. One question and one follow-up each. If you are joining by Zoom, please use the raise hand function to ask a question. Après les mots d'ouverture, nous allons passer aux périodes de questions dans la salle, suivies par Zoom, une question et une question en suivi. Si vous êtes en ligne, s'il vous plaît, utilisez la fonction « Levez la main » pour demander une question. And I will now pass the floor to our speakers.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thank you for being with us today. My name is Emily Dwyer, and I'm the Policy Director at the Canadian Network on Corporate Accountability, a network of 40 organizations and unions from across Canada working together to ensure that Canadian companies respect human rights and the environment when they operate abroad. Canada is at a crossroads and has a clear choice: be a leader or a laggard when it comes to business and human rights. For nearly 20 years, CNCA members have been informing government officials and members of Parliament of evidence of serious, widespread harm linked to Canadian companies operating abroad, especially in the mining sector. Yet instead of establishing rules requiring Canadian companies to respect human rights and the environment, Canada continues to rely on voluntary measures for corporate accountability. Experience shows that voluntary measures don't work. Just a few minutes ago, Canadians heard from defenders in Peru, Zambia, and Bangladesh about ongoing abuses. It's long past time for Canada to rein in corporate abuse. This is what Canadians expect, what impacted communities deserve, and what Canada's international human rights commitments require. To do that, Canada must learn from past failures. Canadian experience with toothless offices like the National Contact Point and the CSR Councillor's Office show that Canada's Ombudsperson for Responsible Enterprise needs the powers to independently investigate in order to be effective. This must include the power to compel documents and testimony. The United Kingdom and Australian experiences show that modern slavery reporting style laws don't result in changes in corporate behavior. Those approaches should not be replicated in Canada. We should not confuse transparency with accountability. Instead, Canada should advance comprehensive and robust laws that are centered on human rights. To be considered comprehensive, Canadian human rights due diligence legislation needs to be consistent with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, recognize that human rights are interrelated, interdependent, and indivisible, and that companies have a responsibility to respect all rights, focus on prevention of harm and respect for rights holders, including requiring companies to do effective due diligence, and be enforceable so that impacted people can access remedy in Canadian courts. And if companies behave recklessly or cause serious adverse impacts, they will face meaningful consequences. There's reason to be optimistic that things are changing in Canada. 2 new private members' bills tabled 1 month ago, if they're passed into law, would be a game changer in helping protect people and the planet from corporate abuse, as CNCA members have been calling for. Bill C-262 and Bill C-263 fulfill the criteria I outlined previously. We thank the members who sponsored those bills, and we'll hear from them in a moment. We are encouraged that Canada's Minister of Labour has been mandated to introduce supply chain legislation to address forced labour and other human rights abuses, and recently indicated such legislation was a priority. And there's hope because of the shared understanding that respecting human rights and protecting the environment are nonpartisan issues. I think we can all be encouraged today to see members of Parliament from across party lines speaking in support of strong action in Canada. The Canadian Network on Corporate Accountability is grateful to each of you for being with us today. I'll pass it to Peter.
Mais là, l'esclavage et le travail forcé en Afrique, le meurtre et la torture des militantes en Amérique centrale, les violences sexuelles en Papouasie-Nouvelle-Guinée. Dans tous ces cas-là, on parle de l'implication des compagnies canadiennes Et ça va à l'encontre des valeurs canadiennes que la très, très grande majorité des Canadiens véhiculent. Il faut que ça change et c'est maintenant le temps d'agir. C'est pour cette raison-là qu'on a présenté des projets de loi, moi et Heather McPherson, 262 et 263, dans un effort vraiment de mettre en place la législation et les lois qui empêchent ce genre d'activité qui est vraiment la honte du Canada. I would like to shout out to the Canadian Network on Corporate Accountability for its inspiration. We're talking about an organization that has had such an impact in terms of what we've been able to put into place. And we have seen the most egregious violations of human rights and allegations taking place that are connected to Canadian corporations acting abroad, whether we're talking about slavery or forced labor in Africa, the murder and torture of activists who were speaking up for the environment and for human rights in Central America, systemic sexual violence in Papua New Guinea. These are all the most egregious chapters in Canadian history. And if Canadians from coast to coast to coast were aware of these clear violations of human rights, they would be absolutely appalled. Many Canadians are, and an increasing number of Canadians are calling on the government to act. That's why we have in place Bill C-262 that's been tabled and Bill C-263. What they do is move us forward into an era where there is corporate social responsibility and no longer impunity for violations of human rights. Bill C-262 puts in place a due diligence framework that corporations, Canadian corporations acting abroad, are obliged to follow. And if they do not follow that due diligence, what this provides for is the opportunity for victims to sue those corporations in Canadian courts. This is a clear incentive to put in place due diligence measures, but it also provides recourse to the victims. And I am overjoyed today that we have colleagues from across the political spectrum that are joining their voices together to say that government needs to act now. We need to put in place these human rights frameworks. We need to ensure that there is no longer impunity for human rights violations abroad.
Thank you, everyone, for being here today. And I also would like to echo my colleague Peter Julian's thanks to CNCA for the incredible work that they have done to move this legislation and to work very hard with parliamentarians across all parties to do more to ensure that Canadian companies are held accountable. You know, today I'm going to speak about my Bill 263, and I have to start by saying that I am deeply disappointed that we are in a situation like this. This is something that I've worked on for many, many years prior to being elected, it is around the core ombudsperson. So the core ombudsperson was in fact promised by the Liberal government to be a strong position that would be able to compel testimony and witness, that would be able to hold Canadian companies to account, predominantly mining companies that are working around the world, that are causing just unbearable suffering for Indigenous communities, for women and girls, for communities in developing countries. And the fact that that was promised in 2015, the fact that in 2018 we received the ombudsperson and that ombudsperson did not have the tools to do the job that was necessary is absolutely appalling. And since then, the news has not gotten better. It has in fact gotten worse. We have a situation with a core ombudsperson, which has spent, the Office of the Ombudsperson has spent millions of dollars. Millions of dollars have been spent. And so you may expect there to be some impact from that position, from the ombudsperson. Unfortunately, there have been, to date, 0 complaints investigated. There have been 0 complaints referred to arbitration, and 0 have been determined to be founded or unfounded. So despite promises by the government, despite a position that is costing taxpayers millions of dollars, we have seen 0 action, 0 support for people who are suffering deeply at the hands of Canadian companies around the world. My bill, Bill C-263, is complementary to my colleague Peter Julian's Bill 262, and is the Responsible Business Conduct Abroad Act. Basically, what it does is it fixes the problems with the core ombudsperson that were put in place intentionally by this current government. So it will give the core ombudsperson the ability to compel testimony, to compel documents, and to do a more thorough and more complete job holding Canadian companies to account abroad. Thank you.
Alors bonjour, mon nom est Simon-Pierre Savard-Tremblay, je suis député de Saint-Hyacinthe-Bagotte et porte-parole du Bloc québécois en commerce international. Ça me fait très plaisir d'être là aujourd'hui. Plaisir, oui mais non, au sens où bien sûr on ne devrait pas être encore en train de discuter d'une telle chose, cela devrait être chose faite depuis longtemps. Les entreprises, les comportements des entreprises qui veulent faire de l'argent à l'étranger, ce qui en soi est un objectif légitime, devraient être assurément encadrés. Lorsqu'il y a des viols de droits humains, et quand on parle de droits humains, on inclut les droits sociaux, on inclut les droits environnementaux, parce que tout le monde devrait avoir droit de respirer un air respirable et de pouvoir boire une eau qui est consommable. J'ai eu l'occasion, à titre de député, de participer à des missions en Colombie et au Chili. Mission d'observation de l'état des droits humains dans ces pays. Au-delà de la violence des États respectifs, des deux États respectifs, ce qui est un autre sujet, on a pu constater qu'il y avait des comportements, on a entendu beaucoup de témoignages par rapport à des comportements d'entreprises dont plusieurs sont canadiennes dans ces pays. Et plusieurs de ces entreprises étaient des entreprises minières. Il faut qu'il existe un recours. Le poste d'ombudsman est essentiellement symbolique. C'est un bureau des plaintes. C'est un site Internet. Il faut qu'il y ait beaucoup plus si on veut pouvoir s'attaquer aux comportements qui ont été dénoncés. Le Bloc québécois a, en 2009, déposé un projet de loi visant à créer une commission de surveillance des activités minières à l'étranger. Une commission qui insistait non pas tant sur la capacité de recevoir des plaintes, mais sur la capacité qu'elle aurait en tant que commission indépendante du pouvoir politique, précisons-le, de mener ses propres enquêtes dès qu'elle a un doute raisonnable. Et elle s'autorisait aussi à viser exclusivement et de manière expresse le ministère des Affaires étrangères lorsqu'il y avait du soutien à des entreprises qui étaient fautives à l'étranger. Malheureusement, le Canada est ce qu'on pourrait appeler un pavillon de complaisance. Plusieurs de ces entreprises ne sont que canadiennes symboliquement, canadiennes, et elles en viennent à s'enregistrer tout simplement à la Bourse de Toronto à cause des multiples avantages. Cependant, à partir du moment où elles s'enregistrent au Canada, elles doivent répondre devant les tribunaux canadiens. Bien sûr, je crois encore que le projet du Bloc à l'époque d'une commission indépendante du pouvoir politique de surveillance des activités à l'étranger demeure nécessaire. Cependant, je suis prêt à appuyer, et le parti est prêt à appuyer, toute initiative qui est un pas dans la bonne direction, qui va dans le bon sens. J'ai accepté de parrainer les deux projets de loi de nos collègues ici présents, de nos collègues du NPD ici présents. Ça m'a fait plaisir de le faire. Notre position est la même, on ne fonctionne pas à l'étiquette. Quand quelque chose est bon, on est en faveur, quitte à ce qu'on tente de l'améliorer encore plus lorsque on en sera rendu à cette partie de l'exercice-là. J'espère que les deux projets de loi en question seront adoptés et j'espère aussi qu'un jour, nous en arriverons à cette commission indépendante avec du mordant, une commission qui a des dents et qui puisse observer et s'autoriser à intervenir de manière indépendante du pouvoir politique, ce qui vaudra certainement plus qu'un ombudsman au pouvoir essentiellement symbolique. Merci.
Okay. I thought that perhaps. Merci tout le monde et particulièrement merci à Emily et toute votre équipe dans le réseau canadien en faveur de responsabilité des entreprises. The Canadian Network on Corporate Accountability has convened us as members of Parliament, and I'm enormously pleased to join, as we have in Parliament for many years now, a call for effective oversight and control to ensure that Canadian companies overseas are not abusing human rights and abusing the environment. C'est clair que les entreprises minières sont, c'est un grand scandale, comme les entreprises minières canadiennes sont bien connues pour les violations des droits humains et l'environnement. We had the creation, which we'd called for years, of the Canadian Ombudsperson for Responsible Enterprise. The acronym is CORE, and we all, and I remember being in press conferences with Heather in 2018 and say, look, the Ombudsperson has not been given the tools to do the job. We saw it from the very beginning, and we need to see action that means we're serious about protecting human rights around the world when exposed to, and this is a terrible thing for Canadians to realize, we're one of the worst overseas in terms of the activities of some of the corporations in Canada operating overseas, particularly in the mining sector. Je suis absolument en faveur des projets de loi éminents de députés 262 et 263. Tout le monde ici, du parti MPD, puis Bloc Québécois, puis notre collègue Nathaniel Erskine-Smith. C'est clair que selon le Parti vert du Canada, nous sommes absolument en faveur des mesures obligatoires pour protéger les droits humains. So I stand with all my colleagues. We need to ensure that Canada deals with, as our colleague from the Bloc just said, this is not a symbolic exercise to have an ombudsperson who can't do anything. That's not good enough, and we need to move forward with real action. Merci.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And it's nice to be here. Thanks, Emily, and everyone from the network for making today happen, but also for all the advocacy that has helped to lead to the legislation we have before us as well. I suppose I'm Nate Erskine-Smith, and I'm a Liberal MP representing the East End of Toronto and Beaches East York. And I come at this from a very simple premise. We expect and require Canadian companies to respect human rights here at home, and we should have the same expectation and impose the same obligations of Canadian companies when they operate abroad. It is not only the right thing to do from a basic moral standpoint, but it is in our own interest if reputation matters, and I think it does. And it comes in a number of different ways potentially, but as you've heard from colleagues, due diligence matters with respect to supply chains, penalties matter in terms of accountability and enforcement, and if we are to really stand up a serious and respectable ombudsperson, it's deserving of a legislative footing, and it needs real powers to compel testimony and documentary production. Now, the second piece I would want to emphasize is the nonpartisan nature of this conversation. Canadians of all political backgrounds, I would say, voters of all backgrounds, care about Canadian companies operating with basic respect for human rights, not only as it relates to reputation, but that too. And we have here before us MPs from most of the major parties, and there are, I think, legislative efforts across party lines as well. So not here today, you've got efforts from Liberal colleagues of mine, John McKay, Liberal efforts from colleagues of mine, Marcus Pawlowski, driving towards the same end. And I would emphasize one final thing, which is when you read the Labour Minister's mandate letter, it says that they're going to introduce legislation to eradicate forced labor from Canadian supply chains and ensure that Canadian businesses operating abroad do not contribute to human rights abuses. So our job in this Parliament, working across party lines, is to guarantee that the government honors and fulfills that commitment. Thanks very much.
So thank you very much, everyone, for your remarks and your support for strong measures to ensure the protection of people and planet from corporate abuse. The CNCA hopes that we can count on you to help raise these issues with your colleagues. We also trust that the Government of Canada hears this message loudly and clearly. Human rights and accountability are non-negotiable. Canada urgently needs a people and planet first approach to business. So with that, we'll put it out to questions.
Thank you. We do not currently have any questions in the room, and there are no attendees on the Zoom link either. So we don't have any questions. So unless you have any further remarks, that would end today's press conference.
One further remark. Nathaniel Erskine-Smith has referenced the work of John McKay, and I just wanted to publicly say that his early advocacy on this goes back at least a decade. And yet, and we almost had a bill passed when it was a minority conservative parliament, but John McKay's efforts weren't supported by his then leader, Michael Ignatieff. But we've made a lot of progress since then. We're all here and committed to making a difference in this parliament. And I hope that anyone listening and seeing our efforts will put your own oar in, contact your MP, and particularly make sure that our Minister of Labour, Seamus O'Regan, knows that his mandate letter matters to all of us. And thank you, Nate, for being here.
I might take the floor for another moment too, just in terms of clarifying and being clear when CNCA is talking about accountability legislation and meaningful due diligence. And in my early remarks, I did say that we really need to make sure to not be confusing transparency with accountability. And for CNCA members, legislation needs to be centered around the rights of impacted people and access to remedy, including obligations to prevent harm, to undertake due diligence, and really importantly, having there be important enforcement mechanisms. So that means both enforcement so that there's serious consequences, meaningful consequences if people are harmed, but also that people can access Canadian courts to access remedy. The CNCA appreciates and welcomes all efforts to bring corporate accountability measures to Parliament, but I also just don't want to leave without clarity that our position is that modern slavery reporting legislation will not change the status quo, will not help impacted communities to access remedy, and will not change corporate behavior. And that's based on the experience that we've seen in other jurisdictions. So what we're really looking for, and the message we're trying to share with the Minister of Labour now, who is speaking about comprehensive legislation, we hope and expect that the legislation that we see from Canada to respond to these abuses is up to the task.
Thank you. That'll end today's press conference.
Me permettez-vous un ajout rapide? J'ai tout simplement fait une omission impardonnable dans mon allocution. J'ai oublié de remercier Emily et le réseau, tout simplement. Alors, je l'ajoute maintenant.
Thank you.
If you're a politician, there's always one more thing.